Hello, everybody. Justin from Stillness in the Storm here. Today, we're going to talk about why wrongness is good. So, why would I say studying wrongness is a good thing? I mean, you might be thinking to yourself, Justin, what the hell are you talking about? That sounds crazy. It's all about seeking the truth. And it is, to be sure. But there's some value to studying wrong things. Now, you may think to yourself, well, okay, but we may come to learn about some piece of information, we may hear about some wild claim, and it just sounds incredulous to us, like, well, the idea that the sky is green or purple, why would I ever want to study that idea? That doesn't sound very valid. It sounds like on its face, it's unbelievable, so why even bother investigating it? Well, first of all, if a claim, in order to prove a claim invalid or false, we need evidence. We need to actually assess the physical world in some way, or at least think about it. Like do some type of logical assessment or philosophic exploration. And one of the things that does is it enhances our truth perceptibility and our truth sensitivity in general. So we might say to ourselves, well, there's no value in something. Here, I'm just looking at my notes here. Well, since I can't be sure if something is true, there's no value in assessing it. So, for example, you may hear a claim like a little boy was rescued from a collapsed building in China. Well, you have no way of determining whether or not that claim is true or not, so there's no point in even thinking about it. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because what happens when you think about things, the way that you get ideas isn't really important. At least not in this respect that I'm talking about now. But the fact that you have an idea means that you can now think about it. And even if this idea came from a place that you may not necessarily feel good about, it may not have a lot of credibility to you, it doesn't necessarily mean the idea is wrong. So the old saying, a clock is always wrong at least twice a day. I'm sorry. A clock is right at least twice a day holds true here. So what does that mean? Well, if a clock is broken, and when I talk about a clock, I'm not talking about a digital clock here. I'm talking about an actual clock with hands, right? Well, if it stops at the, let's say, 12:30 position, well, at 12:30 a.m. and at 12:30 p.m., that wrong clock that is stopped because the batteries went dead is actually true. It's actually telling the right time. So there's that aspect to consider. So when we think about whether or not we should assess a claim, we may consider the source. We may say, well, the source can't be trusted. I don't know who this, I'll put myself in the limelight here. I don't know who this Justin character is. He's telling me to consider wrong ideas, and this is important. Well, clearly he doesn't know what he's talking about. Rah. Okay, or you may, to use a little bit a different example, you may hear about something on the evening news, and you've determined that the evening news is not a good source of information, in which case you say, well, it's the evening news. They lie about everything. Therefore, whatever they're saying now can't be true. So that's the kind of credibility assessment. How well can we rely on the veracity or the truthfulness of a person's statement based on what they've told us in the past? And if in past discernment exercises we've determined that there was no truth or credibility assessed to a person, meaning that the evening news lied to us a couple times, therefore they're not a trustworthy source, the temptation is to say, well, because that person was wrong once, now they are never going to be worthwhile to listen to. But that kind of puts us in another problem, doesn't it? Because, I mean, I've been wrong before. Likely you have been wrong before watching this video, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong all the time. So just because somebody was wrong about something doesn't mean that they're never going to tell us true things in the future. And even if they're an outright liar, so let's take it to the extreme. We're dealing with a pathological liar, okay? Well, a pathological liar has the capacity to transform and grow and change and stop being a pathological liar. And at that point, then we should pay attention to them. But even if they aren't necessarily reformed, it doesn't necessarily mean that what they're speaking, the ideas that they're sharing, don't have value to us. And let's assume for the moment that a pathological liar always speaks untruth 100% of the time. Well, by assessing those untruths, you'll actually get a greater understanding of the truth you do have. So, for example, let's actually talk about a topic. So, again, we're discussing what is the value in assessing wrong ideas, ideas that seem like on the surface wrong. Well, first of all, in our striving to know the truth, in order to grow as persons and beings, and I talk about self-mastery a lot. So in order to develop self-mastery, which improves your life, it makes your life more fulfilling, more rewarding, it makes you a better person, it makes you more compassionate, more wise, more altruistic. Okay, especially if you're following the right course of self-mastery here. I would say ultimately you're going to end up in that camp, and there's a whole discussion we could have in that regard. But the point is that the technique for being self-mastered, the method that we use to become self-mastered, is to seek the truth wherever it leads and to do the work to transform ourselves. So in other words, we use the truth as a guide to shape ourselves. We know that when something that we believed to be true butts up against some new truth, some new piece of information, when we've been red-pilled about something, when we've woke to something, now that new piece of truth, if that really is the truth, we need to do the hard work, and it often is hard, to change ourselves to conform to the truth. And when we change ourselves to conform to the truth, we become mastered beings. We master our consciousness, we master our emotions, we develop spiritual attributes, these kind of things. So, that being said, let's assess a wrong claim. So I'm going to take one that is a pretty good example. I'll probably be talking about a few examples in here, but let's take the example of flat earth theory. So to a lot of people, the flat earth theory just sounds incredulous. It sounds unbelievable on its face, that it's not even worthy of consideration because it's so ridiculous that it's completely unbelievable. It's like not even questionable that the earth is round. Okay. Well, it's interesting because on the other side of the coin, the people who are flat earthers, the people who believe that the earth is flat, usually it's the same philosophy or the same stance. It's so ridiculous to even think that the earth might be round. We're actually living on a spinning ball that's moving 56,000 miles around the sun, that's moving millions of miles per hour around the galaxy. That sounds ridiculous. So again, if incredulity, if the fact that something seemed to you to be unbelievable was the only important factor, then we could leave it at that. But as likely anybody who's honest with themselves knows, just because something seems unbelievable doesn't necessarily mean it is unbelievable. And if you fail to do your due diligence, if you fail to examine the concept or the claim on your own merits by yourself and research it intuitively, you don't really know. So in taking the flat earth model, a lot of people say that the idea that the earth could be flat is ridiculous. Okay, and I am personally, just to set the record straight, I am somebody that has concluded that the earth is spherical, and I've done this because I went to school for physics, so I actually know some of the proofs that they use to ascertain the fact that the earth is spherical. But more to the point, I don't want to rest my beliefs on some expert. So this is what I'm talking about. In order to gain self-mastery, we can't say, well, the scientists and the experts have concluded that the earth is round, therefore I don't have to do my homework. I know it's round. I'm just going to believe what everybody else says. Everybody else says that the earth is round, so it's crazy to think that the earth is flat. Right? This is also an argument you hear sometimes. And it's understandable, let's face it, like coming to a detailed, intrinsic understanding of why something is true or not, it takes a lot of homework. You have to really assess a body of information. If you don't know whether or not the earth is round or flat or not, you may have to learn some physics. You may have to learn some math. You may have to learn about spatial mechanics and things like this. But in the act of doing so, what happens? You gain knowledge, you gain wisdom. So by learning and assessing a claim, just on that topic alone, just on that point alone, by assessing a claim on our own, we develop more detailed understanding of the information because that's what intrinsic knowledge is. So what intrinsic knowledge is it's not resting your beliefs on expert opinion. For example, well, the earth is round because Bill Nye told me so. Or the earth is round because this doctor, I'm trying to think of the other Stephen Hawking. We'll say Stephen Hawking because Stephen Hawking told me so, and he's a man with a lot of credibility and prestige. So if a lot of people say he's right, then he must be right. Well, that's extrinsic knowledge. That's extrinsic belief. You don't really understand why the earth is round. You're just resting your beliefs on somebody else, somebody that you think has a lot of credibility. So you're resting your conclusions on credibility. Well, what if that person is wrong? Okay. And like I was just mentioning, what do you gain by resting your conclusions on somebody else's beliefs, on somebody else's hard work and due diligence? Well, it saves you a little bit of time and energy because you could to arrive at a quick and easy answer, quote unquote. But now using that answer is really difficult because you don't have a lot of intrinsic knowledge. You don't really know for sure. Okay, so by analyzing this concept yourself, by assessing the claim, is the earth flat, you have to study some information. You have to study observation. I mean, again, I don't want this to be turned into a proof why the earth is round video, but my point is that by asking this question for yourself, you have the potential to gain self-mastery because you're going to learn and assess different bodies of information that are going to be used to support one belief or the other, one stance or the other. And if you've done your work properly, if you've really acknowledged the objective facets of reality, then you're going to be looking for an argument, and this is what's called correspondent theory in epistemological philosophy. And epistemology, for those who don't know, is the study of why we know something to be true or not. So this is really important. So in assessing truth, in assessing claims, in assessing the wrongness or the rightness of something, we have to ask ourselves, well, how do I know? What is the evidence? What is the argument? Well, the argument, the actual thought process and the body of evidence that we're assembling together to say that this is true and here's why, that is what makes something true in a personal sense, but also in a social sense. So in our world, when we think about in law, for example, when a lawyer or a series of legal teams are trying to determine whether or not a plaintiff's argument is true or the defense's argument is true, they're going to use the coherence philosophy. And what the coherence argument philosophy says is that, well, if the argument that you come up with in your mind actually represents reality, and it can be demonstrated that that is the case, then that is the truth for all intents and purposes. Okay? So, I mean, there's some nuance here, but what I mean by that is that the person with the best argument wins the truth debate or battle, so to speak. So if you have the best argument for describing why the earth is round, then your argument becomes the quote-unquote truth. And I put quotes around that because the ideas that we use to describe the truth aren't actually the truth. The map isn't the territory. The map is the map. It describes things on the territory, but it isn't the territory itself. And this is important to understand. So for us, insofar as truth seeking and being truth seekers and ideally having the desire to self-master ourselves, it's important for us to do this because when we personally assess a claim, like is the earth flat or not, we develop our own argument, our own personal argument. We put that argument in our own words, and now those ideas are in contact with us. We actually have the ability to use them at a personal level. So it becomes more accessible to us. And then that piece of knowledge, now that it's been verified, now that we've done our due diligence, we can take this piece of knowledge and we can compare it to all the other data in our knowledge set and then make inferences. And this is what I call the knowledge purification process. You know, when you've been red-pilled, it's because some new piece of information is entered into your field, and that new piece of information, you've determined that that is probably the truth. That is the best argument you have. You can't think of anyone personally or anything personally that better describes the situation. And now because of that, there might be conflicts with your worldview. So for example, if I tell you that there are cures for cancer, and you believe that there aren't cures for cancer, and then you go through the due diligence and the homework to assess this claim, and you come to understand, well, yeah, there actually are cures for cancer. Well, now what's going to happen is that new truth, that new piece of information is going to butt up against this other truth, and there's going to kind of be like a conflict, a battle in your mind, so to speak. And what's happening is that you're falling into the abyss, to use a a hero's journey description of the term. You're falling into the abyss. You're confronting the dragon. You're taming your dragon, and you're growing personally. So what happens is that by butting that new truth, that red pill truth against your truth that you've been assembling throughout your life, you're going to come to the understanding that there's pieces of things that you believe that aren't really true, and you need to go back and you need to fix those, because that's going to help you navigate the world. Again, our truth, our knowledge is a map of the world, and it's the thing that we use to navigate to see, okay, well, where do I want to be here? Where do I want to be there? Where are my goals there in the future? So that's largely why it's really important. Now, in assessing, let me speak a little bit more about this. And I know this video is going to go a little bit longer, but that's okay. I want to get these ideas out there. In assessing the wrongness of things, we need to be wise. So we kind of have to pick our battles carefully here. We need to choose our meals wisely, to use another descriptor. So what I mean by that is, there's only so much time and space we have to work with. And while assessing all type of information can be really helpful because it enhances our truth-seeking and discernment abilities so that we can know what the truth is, so we can navigate our lives better, we need to pick and choose things carefully. It's very easy to get pulled off of your life path and go into this kind of like rabbit hole eddy where you're just spinning around trying to figure out if something is true. For example, let's take something out of the ufology field. There's been claims by various people that there are bases on Mars. Well, is there really any way for you personally to know if there's a base on Mars? Do you have access to documentation that has been vetted by sources that let you know that there are bases on Mars? Do you have photographs? Have you observed anything personally with your eyes and your own telescopes? Do you have personal testimony, meaning were you actually taken to Mars and went on one of these colonies? Likely no. For most people, the answer is no for these 4 things and more that I could list. So you could spend like your whole life trying to assess whether this claim is true. And I do think that is one point that should be considered carefully. But you have to pick. You have to make some choices. Because ultimately, it's not just about focusing on one little idea to see if it's true or not. We want to digest many different ideas. We want to have an eclectic body of knowledge that we're drawing from. And we've evaluated and we've developed intrinsic knowledge for. So we have to be wise about picking and choosing our battles. So let's think about another example. Well, how do you know? Why is it valuable to assess seemingly ridiculous claims? Well, it lets you know, first of all, it'll reveal when you find that something is actually untrue. So when you've actually discerned that something is wrong, you'll now have a method for proving a negative. Now, this is something that you hear a lot about in various circles. Whether you're looking to TV personalities or you're thinking about going into a university, or you're just navigating the areas of alternative media, you might hear the notion that it's not possible to prove a negative, so don't try. Well, that's not actually true. It is possible to prove a negative. So let's take this example here. So let's say a friend comes to you and they say, hey, did you know that there's an elephant in your living room? And you're like, what? That sounds ridiculous. Of course there's not an elephant in my living room. Now, you may feel like, I don't even have to go look. Like, that is such a stupid idea. Maybe you're a little kinder. Maybe you're like, that's such a incredulous, a wild, fantastic claim that it seems completely untrue. And you may decide, based on the fact that it doesn't jive with your internal mechanisms, that it really isn't true. Or you might conclude that it is, but without actually doing your homework. But let's say you do decide to do your homework. Let's say you go to your living room like, all right, well, my friend, he's telling me that there's elephants in my living room. I guess I better go see what the heck he's talking about. And you go into your living room and you're looking around. And you're like, okay, well, there's my couch. Oh, yep, there's the TV stand there. Oh, there's my bookshelf. Yep, there's that carpet. Okay. Yep, there's my coffee table. Not seeing any elephants. I don't know what my friend's talking about. Well, you've just proved a negative right there, haven't you? So how do you prove a negative? Well, the way you prove a negative, the way you prove that something isn't true, is by looking at the space and time that that description or argument describes, and then looking to see what's actually there. So the way to see that something isn't true is by knowing what is actually there. So in this instance, the way we know that there's not an elephant in our living room is because we looked in the living room and we can see everything else in the living room, but we don't see an elephant. So the absence of a phenomenon in relation to the thing, the argument that describes it, proves the negative. In this case, that there is no elephant. Now, what that also does is it not only tells us that there isn't an elephant in the living room, but you increase your understanding of what is in the living room. So if you didn't do your homework, if you didn't actually go in the living room, you wouldn't really know for certain what's there. All you'd have to rest your conclusions on is your own credibilities, for lack of a better way of describing it. But we want to transcend just credibility. Credibility will guide us a little bit. It's kind of like it's like a warm or cold assessment. Kind of like emotional resonance. Emotional resonance, if it drives with our belief system, it may or may not be true. But we need more than just that to prove if something is true. We need to go into the living room, maybe take a picture of the living room and say, hey, look, man, you show this picture to our friend and we say, there's no elephant in here. So now we have the ability to prove a negative. So you've got that technique under your belt. So anytime somebody tells you, you can't prove a negative, well, you know that there is actually a method to doing so. It doesn't mean it can be done necessarily because, proving the absence of some things is just beyond our approach. I mean, most of us don't have access to Alpha Centauri. So if somebody tells us that there's a giant Dyson sphere around Alpha Centauri, well, none of us are there to be able to make that determination necessarily. Okay. So one of the other things that, let me just check my notes here. Yeah, so one of the other things that going through this exercise does is it in the act of proving something wrong or contemplating the wrongness of something, which you end up mustering, just like I was mentioning, you end up drawing forth all of these pieces of true knowledge that you've been gathering and distilling in your life to use as an argument to support the fact that you are asserting that something is untrue. So for example, to use the flat earth analogy, by answering the question for yourself, well, is the earth flat or is the earth round? You have to think about all sorts of data points. You might think about flight routes. You might think about the Schumann resonance. You might think about seismology. You might think about space weather. You might think about weather patterns in general, like the Coriolis effect. You might think about geomagnetic activity. So all these pieces of data, these pieces of evidence form a tapestry, a picture that we call proof. So proof you could think of as a story or a narrative that describes something. And that thing that it's describing is the truth in this instance. So when you answer the question, well, is the earth flat or round? And you assess the evidence, if you're doing your homework well, and I know, some people will be like, Justin, what the heck, you're saying that, like, if I believe in flat earth, I haven't done my homework well. Well, I'm sorry. That's basically what I'm saying. But I think you should do the homework anyway. I'm not necessarily trying to beat you over the head with my beliefs, but I am saying that you should think about these things. Ask yourself honestly. If you're being honest and you're assessing all of the available evidence, then when you put all these pieces on the table, you're going to have to build a narrative. You got to write a book report that describes what you're seeing on the table. And that report, it has to describe what's on the table. It can't describe things that aren't on the table. So in your process of answering this question, whether or not the earth is round or not, or to rephrase, whether or not it's flat, you're actually going to come to an understanding of why the earth is not flat, it's round. So you'll have a detailed understanding now, just like you had a detailed understanding of why there wasn't an elephant in your living room. So let me just check and see if there's anything else that I wanted to mention here. So what ends up happening as we contemplate more untruths, more falsehood, is that we verify the truths that we know more succinctly. So by thinking about untruth, by thinking about wrongness, and understanding it at an intrinsic personal level, it actually enhances our awareness of the true things we know, and that allows us to weave these pieces together. So, for example, you might have realized that the earth was round, but you didn't necessarily know that the ringing of the earth in relation to earthquakes. So when an earthquake happens, it sends shock waves, P waves and S waves, through the earth, and it vibrates all of the stuff inside the earth. And because of that, you can actually take imaging systems and computer models and model the inside of the earth. You may not have recognized that that's what was happening, but in the act of contemplating this, you may come to that conclusion. So in the act of contemplating wrongness to prove whether or not something is right or wrong, we develop a greater understanding of the truth that we already know. We actually develop new knowledge. We create new tapestries of knowledge. We get a better perspective on the things that we know. Now let me end this video here by saying, in the act of doing this contemplation work, by assessing the wrongness or rightness of something, we always need to be humble. We need to keep an open mind. So I am a strong advocate of people using their critical thinking skills, doing more than just feeling, but feeling and thinking, being holistic, okay? But also staying open-minded and realizing that our knowledge is limited. So again, the truth for us, for finite creatures, because the truth is infinite, it is this kind of transcendent reality. And I won't go into that in this video, but we could talk a lot about that. For us as finite creatures, we're building truth for us, for ourselves. And the way we do that is by developing the best argument possible. So the argument that best describes a situation is the one that we're going to say is the truth. Or to use an analogy, if everybody's taking a photograph of something with their smartphone, the person that has the best photograph, the one that's the most highest resolution where you can see the most detail, that's the one that is the truth. And it's the same way when we talk about arguments or descriptions of truth. So, because our knowledge is limited as individuals, we're not resting our conclusions on academics or experts or gurus or ETs or any type of guru you could think of, then we need to make our own arguments complete and clear. And the more we can do that, the more it strengthens our understanding. But we also have to recognize that we have to be humble. So I hope in your search for truth and wisdom that you don't fall into the incredulity trap or the credibility trap, which says that because a premise or a claim or an assertion sounds just ridiculous to me, that I don't even have to bother looking into it. I know it's untrue. Well, I can tell you from 7 years of truth seeking that I abandoned that notion a long time ago, thankfully. My personal take on this, and I'll finish up this video with this anecdote, is I began my truth-seeking journey because in 2010, Julian, co-founder of Stillness in the Storm, found a movie called The Gerson Miracle, which is all about a man named Dr. Max Gerson who discovered cures for cancer in 1928 in his efforts to treat tuberculosis. And in the case studies he was doing for tuberculosis, he used juicing, and he actually used coffee enemas for detoxification. And what he noticed was not only was he able to cure their tuberculosis, but he was also able to cure cancer and all sorts of other incurable diseases. And he actually testified before Congress, the U.S. Congress, in the 1940s. I believe it was 1946. And the congressional panels told him essentially that they weren't refuting that his cure worked. What they were refuting was that they could make money off of it. And because they couldn't make money off of it, they wouldn't endorse it. And then several years later, they actually made it illegal. So anybody who tried to present this information to their patient as a doctor would lose their license. So in 2010, I'm kind of in this place where I'm thinking, I know all the answers. I went to school for physics. I've been studying psychology and biology as an amateur for years. And I know if they were going to have cures for cancer out there, I'd know because I'd hear about it. So I was resting my beliefs in watching this movie on incredulity. I was resting it on the effectively extrinsic belief because I didn't really know for sure whether or not cures for cancer didn't exist. I was just assuming that the the wizards of science would have already made this conclusion, and therefore I didn't have to do my homework, right? This is an argument a lot of us deal with. And as I mentioned earlier, because time and space is limited, we kind of have to do this. I mean, right now, you're listening to me as a quote-unquote expert on this idea of assessing wrongness and understanding wrongness. So, well, what I ended up doing was getting red-pilled instead. The science part of me was really understanding some of the scientific concepts that were offered in the movie and subsequent book that I ended up reading months later. And I did a lot of research trying to prove that it was untrue, when in reality it ended up being true. So, and in the process, I red-pilled myself. So in the act of trying to prove that something was wrong, I actually did the reverse. I humbled myself. I had to go through a kind of dark night of the soul moment where I had to fall into the abyss, reform my belief systems, because our belief systems help us organize our reality. So this is one reason why people tend to react violently against any claim that their beliefs might not be accurate, is because that, and as soon as you realize that your beliefs aren't right, you should, and most people do, recognize that, man, I got to do some homework. I got to figure out what is right so I can navigate my life better. I got to find what the map is again, right? Just like I was talking about earlier. So there's a perfect example of this. So let's see. Yeah, I pretty much covered all my notes. So, all right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for listening to this video and your patronage. You can find my work at stillnessinthestorm.com. You can find social media at Sits Show Twitter and Facebook /Sits Show. You can contribute to the work we're doing here at Stillness in the Storm. Now, Stillness in the Storm is a viewer-supported enterprise, so if it wasn't for the valuable contributions of viewers like you, we couldn't do what we do here. So we greatly appreciate your contributions, which you can make either via Patreon or PayPal link in the description of this video or on my site, stillnessinthestorm.com. And we also have advertisements on my website, Stillness in the Storm, specifically so that people can contribute for free. So every time you click on an ad that you find an interest in, no more than once or twice a day, please, then it'll actually send a small contribution our way. It doesn't cost you anything. And every click helps support us. And this is also true for other alternative media, by the way. You know, when I am on other people's videos, when I watch other people's videos or I read their articles, I always be sure to click on their ads because it's a way to contribute to their work. So I greatly appreciate all of the contributions. I appreciate your time, that you're willing to actually listen to me, somebody who's crazy like me. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and happy truth seeking. Much love. Take care.